The number is $89,700. For the American family just a few years from retirement, that is the median amount saved in their retirement account. It's a terrifyingly small number. A figure that guarantees a future of anxiety, of working longer than planned, of depending on children, or of simply running out of money. This is why millions of Americans start their day not with coffee, but with a glance at the stock market, a ritual of hope and dread. We have all been turned into amateur Wall Street traders, managing our own personal high-stakes hedge fund. We pick our mutual funds, we rebalance our portfolios, we obsess over expense ratios. We do this because we've been told that our retirement security is our responsibility. Your success or your failure rests entirely on your shoulders. But was it always this way? Did your grandparents worry about the NASDAQ Q composite over breakfast? The answer is no. For a huge portion of the 20th century, the burden of retirement wasn't on the individual at all. It was on the company. So how did this monumental shift happen? How did the responsibility for the financial future of an entire nation get transferred from the institution to the individual? The answer is not a grand conspiracy or a decades-long plan. The modern retirement crisis we live in today was created by an accident. It was the result of the IRS validating a loophole in the 1978 Revenue Act. A clause so obscure, it was originally intended only as a clever profit-sharing tool for a handful of wealthy executives. This is the story of that accident. We will trace how a consultant's clever idea for his banking clients was unintentionally supercharged by an IRS memo. We'll see how corporations, desperate to escape the ironclad promises of the old system, saw this loophole not as a mistake, but as a perfect escape hatch. This is the story of how that single consequential decision in 1981 opened the floodgates, dismantled a world of guarantees, and created the $89,700 problem. Before the 401k, retirement wasn't a gamble. For millions of American workers, it was a promise, written in ink and backed by the full faith and credit of their employer. This was the age of the defined benefit pensions. The concept was simple, almost elegant. Think of it as a contract. Your company made you a straightforward offer. Work for us for 30 years, and we will pay you a set amount of money every single month, from the day you retire until the day you die. The check just showed up. It was predictable. It was guaranteed. This is why the central question of risk was so different. If the stock market crashed, it wasn't the employee's problem. It was the company's. The corporation was legally on the hook to manage the pension fund, to make wise investments, and most importantly, to make up any shortfall out of its own pocket. The entire burden of market risk was carried by the employer. Your retirement was their liability. But for corporate America, this guarantee was a ball and chain. A pension plan was a massive, unpredictable, and permanent expense on their balance sheets. Actuaries had to guess how long their retirees would live, and economists had to guess how the market would perform decades into the future. A wrong guess could cost billions. This is why, by the 1970s, many executives were desperately looking for a way out. They just hadn't found one yet. The way out arrived not with a bang, but in the fine print. In 1978, Congress passed a sprawling piece of legislation called the Revenue Act. It was a dense, complicated bill full of tax adjustments, and buried deep within its pages was an obscure provision. Section 401, subsection K. This is the point where history pivots. What was this clause actually for? Its authors intended it as a niche tool for high-paid executives. The problem they were solving was simple. When a CEO got a big annual bonus, it could push them into a much higher tax bracket. Section 401k was designed to give them an option. They could choose to defer some of that bonus, putting it into a tax-sheltered account instead of taking it as cash. Think of it as a small, private lockbox, available only to the top brass. It was never envisioned as a replacement for the company-wide pension. It wasn't meant for the factory worker, the secretary, or the middle manager. It was a surgical fix for a tax headache affecting a few dozen people at the top of the corporate ladder. But here's the consequential detail. The language used in the law was vague. It was imprecise. Lawmakers, focused on the executive perk, never clearly defined who could use it or how. They had created a tool for one specific job, but they had accidentally built it like a Swiss Army knife. And in that ambiguity, a door was left unlocked. This is why a clause that almost no one noticed would soon become the most powerful tool for dismantling the very pensions it was never meant to touch. The man who found the key to that unlocked door was not a politician or a Wall Street banker. He was a benefits consultant from Pennsylvania named Ted Benna. His job was to help companies navigate the complex world of employee compensation. And in 1980, he had a problem. A client bank wanted to create a new savings plan for its employees, but the existing options were unattractive. While wrestling with this challenge, Benna was reading through the new tax code. He got to Section 401k. He read the words, and then he read them again. An idea began to form. The language said an employee could choose between cash or a company contribution to a plan. Everyone assumed this meant a one-time executive bonus. But Benna had a different, more radical interpretation. What if the cash wasn't a bonus, but an employee's regular salary? What if an employee could choose to contribute a piece of their own paycheck to the plan before taxes were taken out? This was the epiphany. And he added a strategically potent twist. What if the company encouraged them to do it by offering to asterisk match a portion of their contributions? Suddenly, it wasn't just a tax deferral scheme for the rich. It was a savings vehicle for everyone, supercharged with what felt like free money from the employer. Benna had effectively invented a new financial engine from a few ambiguous lines of tax code. He drew up a proposal for his client bank, creating what is now recognized as the very first 401k plan. His own lawyers were skeptical, warning him the IRS would never approve such an aggressive reading of the law. But Benna was convinced he was right. He submitted the plan for approval, setting up a collision course with federal regulators. The entire future of American retirement now rested on their decision. Ted Benna had thrown a spark into the dry machinery of American bureaucracy. Now he had to wait to see if it would catch fire or be snuffed out. His lawyers were certain the Internal Revenue Service would reject his interpretation of Section 401k. It was too novel, too audacious. It stretched the original intent of the law, a niche rule for executive profit sharing, to its breaking point. This is the moment where a clever idea could have died in a memo. But something unexpected was happening inside the IRS. Regulators were drafting proposed rules for the 1978 Revenue Act, and they were looking at the exact same language Benna was. They arrived at a similar, stunning conclusion. When they published their proposed regulations in November 1981, they didn't shut Benna down. They validated him. The rules explicitly confirmed that an employee's regular salary could be contributed to a plan before taxes. This was the key. The government's own interpretation legitimized Benna's radical idea. It wasn't a loophole anymore. It was now an officially sanctioned mechanism. This quiet, bureaucratic decision is the single most important event in the story of modern retirement. Because the IRS gave its blessing, Ted Benna's creation wasn't just a one-off plan for a single bank in Pennsylvania. It was now a replicable, scalable product that had a government seal of approval. The consultant's epiphany was about to become a nationwide revolution. The floodgates were now open, and on the other side, corporate America was waiting, desperate for a way out of a promise it no longer wanted to keep. Why did the 401k spread like wildfire? Because for corporate America in the early 1980s, it wasn't a new benefit. It was the perfect escape hatch. To understand the corporate mindset, you have to understand the immense pressure they were under. Stiff international competition and punishing inflation were squeezing profits, and on their balance sheets, there was a ticking time bomb: the pension. Pensions were what's known as a defined benefit plan. The name says it all. The benefit was defined, guaranteed. The company promised a specific payout, say $2,000 a month, for the rest of an employee's life. This put all the risks squarely on the company's shoulders. They had to manage the investments, guess how long retirees would live, and cover any shortfall. It was a massive, unpredictable, and lifelong liability. This is why the 401k was so strategically attractive. It was a defined contribution plan. The company's contribution was defined, a simple match of, say, 3% of an employee's salary. And that's where the company's promise ended. All the risk of market crashes, inflation, and outliving your savings was transferred from the corporation's balance sheet to the individual employee's shoulders. It was a calculated and profoundly effective shift. For a chief financial officer, the choice was simple. Would you rather have a guaranteed, lifelong, and unpredictable expense, or a predictable, controllable, and limited one. The 401k allowed them to legally and gracefully exit the pension promise. They weren't just adding a new savings plan, they were preparing to dismantle the old world of retirement security. But corporations faced a delicate strategic problem. They had their escape hatch. But how could they convince millions of American workers to willingly walk through it? How do you persuade people to trade a guaranteed, lifelong income for a risky market account dependent on their own investment savvy? The answer was a calculated and highly effective marketing campaign. The 401k wasn't sold as a replacement for the pension, it was framed as a modern upgrade. This is the moment the narrative of retirement began to change. The key words were no longer security and guarantee. They were freedom, choice, and empowerment. You, the American worker, were now in the driver's seat. You could choose your own investments. You could watch your money grow. It was an appeal to the American spirit of individualism. A pension was paternalistic, a relic of the past. The 401k was for the modern, self-reliant employee. And then came the hook, the behavioral trigger that made the whole thing irresistible, the company match. This was the masterstroke. For every dollar you put in, your company would put in 50 cents, or even a full dollar, up to a certain limit. It was simple, it was tangible, and psychologically, it felt like free money. To not participate was to leave a pile of cash on the table. This immediate, visible gain was powerful enough to obscure the immense, invisible risk being transferred onto the employee's shoulders. Because of this framing, workers didn't feel like they were losing a guarantee. They felt like they were getting a raise. With millions of employees now signing up and contributing every paycheck, a critical question emerged. Where was all of this money going? The answer? Straight to Wall Street. And it triggered a gold rush. Before the 401k, retirement money was mostly locked away in corporate pension funds, managed by a small number of institutional investors. But now, a fire hose of new capital, trillions of dollars over the coming decades, was flowing directly from American paychecks into the market. This created a colossal new customer base. An entire industry asset management exploded to service this demand. Mutual fund companies, which bundle stocks and bonds for individual investors, became household names. Their business model was strategically simple and immensely lucrative. Charge a small annual fee, a percentage of the assets they managed for you. A tiny slice of a very, very large pie is a fortune. This is why the shift from pensions to 401ks became irreversible. It created a permanent, systemic beneficiary whose profits depended on the system's expansion. A powerful new lobby was born, one that would spend decades influencing policy to ensure that their new river of gold would never, ever run dry. And so, a system born from an obscure tax code footnote, weaponized by a benefits consultant, and unleashed by a single IRS memo, became the bedrock of American retirement. What started as a niche perk for executives became the default for nearly everyone. Because of this chain of events, we find ourselves here today, in a world of profound retirement anxiety, a world where decades of diligent saving can be wiped out by a single market crash just before you plan to stop working. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because of a single, monumental, and nearly invisible change, the Great Risk Shift. Think of it this way. A traditional pension was like a giant, industrial-strength umbrella held by the company. All employees stood underneath it together. If a storm hit, a recession, a market downturn, the company got wet, but the workers stayed dry. The risk was collective, managed by a large institution designed to weather financial storms over decades. The 401k was a strategically consequential move. Corporate CFOs folded up that giant, expensive umbrella. Then, they handed every single employee their own small, personal one and wished them good luck. This is the hidden mechanism at the heart of our modern retirement crisis. The atomization of risk, the burden of navigating Wall Street, of outliving your savings, of retiring into a bear market. That entire mountain of risk was surgically lifted from the corporate balance sheet and placed squarely on the shoulders of the individual American worker. They were now the fund manager, the market timer, and the actuary for their own life. This is why today's retirement feels less like a finish line and more like a lottery. It explains why two people can work at the same company for 30 years, save the same percentage of their income, and end up with wildly different outcomes. One might retire a millionaire, the other might face poverty. The difference wasn't their work ethic, it was luck, it was timing. It was the brutal consequence of a system that privatized gains, but, most importantly, socialized failure onto the individual. The story of the 401k is not a simple tale of corporate greed. It is the story of a calculated transfer of risk, marketed as freedom and choice. It replaced a promise of security with an opportunity to invest, and the unstated, but very real, opportunity to fail. The old system was a guarantee. The new one is a gamble. And we are all living with the results. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history behind our modern world. And leave a comment. What do you think the future of retirement should look like?